I'd been driving for DoorDash for about 8 months by the time this happened. The money wasn't great, but it helped pay the bills while I was finishing my degree. I typically worked evening shifts after my classes, usually wrapping up around 10 p.m. But that night, I decided to stay out later than usual because I was short on rent money. It was almost midnight when I accepted what I thought would be my final delivery of the night. The order was from this 24-hour diner on the edge of town. Just a single meal going to an address about 15 minutes away. The app showed a decent tip, so I figured it was worth the drive. The diner was empty except for a cook and a waitress who barely looked up from her phone when I walked in. I confirmed the order details, grabbed the bag, and headed back to my car. It was one of those perfect fall nights. Crisp air, clear sky full of stars, barely any traffic on the roads. My phone directed me to turn off the main highway onto a rural route I'd never taken before. The road narrowed, streetlights became fewer and farther between, and soon I was driving through what seemed like an endless tunnel of trees. My headlights only illuminated about 20 feet ahead, making it feel like I was driving into a void. I remember thinking this was strange. There weren't many houses out this way, mostly just farmland and woods. My car's old radio started picking up static instead of music, which didn't help the creeping feeling of isolation. My phone announced I had arrived at my destination, but all I could see was darkness. I slowed down, scanning both sides of the road, and spotted what looked like a dirt driveway about 50 feet ahead. There was no mailbox or house number to confirm the address. I pulled in cautiously, my tires crunching over gravel. About 100 yards back from the road, I could make out what appeared to be a small house. Only one window showed any light, a dim, flickering glow that looked more like candlelight than electricity. Normally, I'd just leave the food at the door, take a picture, and be on my way. But the app instructions specifically requested hand delivery. I texted the customer to let them know I had arrived and waited in my car for a response. Nothing came back. After 5 minutes of silence, I decided to just drop the food at the door and leave. I grabbed the bag, turned on my phone's flashlight, and made my way up the overgrown path to the house. The wooden steps to the porch creaked under my weight, and I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. Once I got closer, I heard a faint whimpering sound coming from inside. It sounded like someone in pain, or maybe crying. I called out, "Hello? DoorDash delivery." The whimpering stopped immediately. Complete silence followed. "Hello?" I tried again. "I'm just leaving your food here, okay?" That's when a voice responded, "Bring it in, please. I can't come to the door." Every instinct told me to drop the food and run. But what if it was someone who really needed help? "I'm sorry, I can't enter your house," I replied, setting the bag down. "I'll leave it right here by the door." "Please," the voice called again, sounding different this time, lower, almost like multiple voices speaking in unison. "We've been waiting for you." "We." I backed away, nearly tripping down the porch steps. As I turned to run, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Parked behind the house, barely visible in the darkness, were at least 3 cars, all with their driver's doors still open. I sprinted back to my car, fumbling with my keys, adrenaline making my hands shake violently. Just as I got the door open, I heard movement. Not from the house, but from the woods surrounding the property. Footsteps. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. As I backed out onto the road, my headlights swept across the tree line. For just a split second, I thought I caught glimpses of a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just standing there. I sped all the way back to the highway, calling 911 once I reached the main road. The dispatcher took my information and said they'd send an officer to check it out. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. I decided to look up the address on Google Maps. Just an isolated house on a large property. I did some more digging and found out that the property was declared as vacant. I never heard back from the police. I called twice to follow up, but was told there was nothing to report. I quit DoorDash the following week. After my divorce 3 years ago, I needed to escape the constant reminders of my failed marriage. I'd spent nearly a decade in a relationship that had slowly suffocated me, and when it finally ended, I felt like I couldn't breathe in our small coastal town where everyone knew our business. I found a listing for a lakeside cabin in northern Minnesota that promised solitude. A small A-frame structure nestled among pine trees on the edge of a crystal-clear lake, miles from the nearest town. The photos showed morning mist rising off the water, a wooden dock stretching into the lake, and interiors with warm wooden walls and a stone fireplace. I booked it for 3 months, packed my car, and left without telling many people where I was going. It took me 2 whole days to get there. When I finally turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin, the sunlight was filtering through the dense forest canopy in shafts of gold. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised, rustic but comfortable, with huge windows facing the lake. That first evening, I sat on the deck with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of pink and orange. For the first week, everything was perfect. I'd wake up to the sound of birds instead of traffic, spend my mornings writing on the deck, take afternoon swims in the lake, and fall asleep to the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The nearest neighbor was about half a mile down the shoreline, which was close enough if I needed help, but far enough away that I rarely saw them. On my 8th night there, I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Then I heard it. Splashing sounds coming from the lake. Not the gentle, rhythmic sound of waves, but deliberate splashing, like someone swimming. I got out of bed and cautiously approached the large window overlooking the water. The moon was full, casting enough light to see the lake's surface. About 30 yards from shore, I could make out what looked like a person swimming. My first thought was that it must be a night swimmer from one of the other cabins, but something felt off. The movements weren't smooth like someone enjoying a midnight swim. They were erratic, almost frantic. For a moment I wondered if someone was drowning. I hesitated, debating whether I should call out or try to help. But then the swimmer suddenly stopped, and I saw them turn in my direction. Even from that distance, I could feel them staring directly at me. A chill ran down my spine, and I stepped back from the window. I stood in the darkness of my bedroom, heart pounding. After several minutes, I gathered the courage to look again. The lake was empty and still. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe my imagination was playing tricks on me and I went back to bed. The next morning, I convinced myself I had overreacted. The lake looked so peaceful in the daylight, it was hard to reconnect with the unease I'd felt during the night. I even took my usual afternoon swim, though I found myself constantly scanning the shoreline. That evening, I was reading by the fireplace when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the property manager had assured me I would have complete privacy. I approached the door cautiously and called out, "Who is it?" "Sorry to bother you," came a man's voice. "I'm from the cabin down the shore. Thought I'd introduce myself." Something in his tone made me hesitate. I peered through the peephole to see a middle-aged man with a fishing hat and flannel shirt, typical lake attire. He looked harmless enough, but I still felt uneasy. I opened the door just a few inches and said hi, trying to sound friendly. "Noticed you moved in last week," he said, his eyes scanning what he could see of the cabin's interior. "You settling in okay?" We chatted briefly. He introduced himself as Dan and mentioned he'd been coming to this lake for 30 years. Just as I was starting to relax, he said something that froze me in place. "The lake's beautiful for swimming, isn't it? Especially at night." I nodded mechanically, my mouth suddenly dry. I managed to tell him I agreed. "Well, I'll let you get back to your evening," he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just wanted to say welcome to the lake." After he left, I double-checked all the locks and closed every curtain. That night, I deliberately avoided looking out at the lake, but I could hear splashing again, closer to shore this time. The next day I called the property manager to ask about Dan. Her response was that there was no one named Dan in any of the cabins nearby. The closest property is owned by a family from Chicago who won't be up until August. I packed my things that same day. As I was loading my car, I noticed wet footprints on the dock. Footprints that led from the water up to my cabin door, then circled the entire building before returning to the lake. I never found out who this Dan was, or who was swimming in the lake. I don't think I want to know.